This video is an engineer task video. It is on mortar rounds used in booby traps. Now, most of what I'm going to show you, the source for those is out of Vietnam, but not all of them. And I will let you know where I came across these. Now, first question is going to be, why would a guerrilla use mortar rounds in booby traps and not just launch them at the enemy? Well, there's many reasons for that. One of them is it could be a caliber of mortar round that they do not have a launcher for, and they cannot create an improvised launcher for that round. The next could be it's some type of misfire, some type of dud, or a piece of unexploded ordnance. A round that was fired at them, the propellant is expended, it landed in some extremely soft earth, so soft it did not activate the fuse. Well, that guerrilla probably isn't going to try to repack the propellant on it and fire that back at the counterinsurgent. So he's now got a piece of ordnance there that has the strength of about a hand grenade if it's a 60 millimeter mortar round, or 50 if it's in that area. And, you know, he's not going to let it go to waste. So first off here, the easiest one, and this is one that does come from Vietnam, attaching it to a tripwire to fall out of a tree. So we have a tripwire strung across a trail from one stake to another. This one over here is going to be like a forked stake turned upside down so that the tripwire runs through it. The tripwire then runs up to a tree, up over a branch, and is tied off in front of the tail on the mortar round. Now, in order to set this off, they are using the impact fuse. So if they have an impact fuse, they're going to pull that safety pin from it to prep it. Directly below where that round is, they're going to put a really big rock. And this stuff's going to be hidden in the bushes. This is going to be hidden up in the leaves in the tree. So the counterinsurgent comes along, hits the tripwire, breaks it, round falls out of the tree, onto the rock, the fuse detonates. Now this next one is also out of Vietnam. This is one that I've seen in a lot of different pictures, a lot of different videos and stuff on training out of Vietnam, where you have a tripwire attached to an improvised pull fuse, which is inside the fuse well on the mortar round. Now the improvised fuse, this is one of those pull fuses that the Viet Cong seem to have a almost obsession with. They used this with a lot of different type of ordnance. They used it with their hand grenades. They used it in other types of booby traps. So you had a plug of wood here of some type. It could be wood, could be bamboo. Inside here you have a cavity. That cavity is lined with friction compound. You have a hole that is drilled through for the tripwire or pull wire from this fuse to go through. This pull wire is attached to what looked like a little copper bell, according to the books. Now on that copper bell was attached match compound. And then directly behind it, we had a non-electric blasting cap at the end. So this is really small. If you think about the size of a blasting cap, it's not going to be really large. You're talking about something that's, you know, about the diameter of a cigarette. Counterinsurgent comes along, hits that tripwire. This mortar round is going to be wedged between a couple rocks or something just to keep it from moving. The tripwire pulls on the pull wire in the fuse here, pulling the bell up the little cavity here. You get the friction compound and the match compound come into contact. You get friction, you get heat, you get a spark. And the blasting cap goes off, setting off the mortar round. Now, in order to get the mortar round to go off, more than likely they had this probably sunk into some type of plastic explosive or some type of TNT that they had poured into there and cast to create their little booster charge in there before they put all this in. This next one here is out of Yugoslavia from the Bosnian Civil War. I actually got this from materials we had to study back then, we had to memorize. I tried to find the training circular that this is from, and I cannot find a copy of it online. For some reason, the information from the Bosnian Civil War, all those publications and stuff we had all through the 90s, you know, letting us know how evil the Serbs were and all that stuff, and what type of stuff was being used on the battlefield, all of that stuff has essentially disappeared. It's been scrubbed from the internet. I cannot find PDFs on it. But a common thing that I remember we had to study, you would have a trail going through the woods, going through the brush. On either side of the trail, they would have a mortar round on each side. And then in each mortar round, they would have a MUV series pull fuse. You would have a tripwire going between the fuses attached to the pull rings on the fuses. So you would have the enemy soldier would come down a trail, they would hit that tripwire, and it would pull the safety pin from at least one of, if not both of, those pull fuses, setting off the mortars on either side. So if you had a patrol that was trying to move through there, you know, you just took out a big group of people. If I remember correctly, for Yugoslavia, this was primarily 60 millimeter and 82 millimeter mortar rounds that they would do this with, which with the 60 millimeter being the more common because that was more common in use by their forces. Now the next one here is actually out of Iraq, believe it or not. Even the Fedayeen would use mortar rounds in booby traps. So what you had is a smaller mortar round, looked like typically it was a 60 millimeter, and then sunk into it, you had a Russian grenade fuse, a UZ RGM fuse. That fuse, it looked like in some of the pictures I seen, it looked like they had shoved it into Semtex that they had used to fill the fuse well on a mortar round. This mortar round was hidden inside black trash bags, and then they would have, the tripwire would come out the bag. So basically you had a small hole in the bottom of the bag, you had the tripwire was already tied to the pull ring, you ran the tripwire out of it, you take it to where you were going to set it up. They would hide it in piles of trash, hide it inside brush, you know, bushes and that stuff, in an area where they were trying to channelize coalition forces to increase the chances of being set off. They'd run the tripwire to the other side, attach it off to some type of anchor. It could be a doorpost, could be a stake, could be just, you know, a nail that was driven into the side of a building and they tied it off to that. After they ran the tripwire across, they'd go through quick, weaken up the safety pin, and then finish camouflaging the whole thing while making sure they didn't pull the pull pin themselves, and then move out of the area. Coalition forces would come through, they're doing a sweep, checking the area. Maybe they'll find that tripwire, maybe they won't. They'll come through, hit the tripwire, pull the safety pin out of the hand grenade fuse. 3 to 5 seconds later, that mortar round would go off, unless they figured out, like the VC did, on how to remove the time element. I didn't see any information on that in the book I looked at that had this one. Now this next one is out of Vietnam. You'd have a trail, and then in the trail they had a couple pressure boards. I did a video on this, on how it was set up with batteries. You have a wire coming across this, attached to an electric blasting cap. That electric blasting cap was inside the mortar round. Now, according to manuals I found that reference this, they said it was very common that the Viet Cong would actually drill out the bottom of the fuse well of the mortar round, and they would make a fuse well in there to accept the electric blasting cap, which they would push in there, most likely using a stick. If they didn't have a drill, they probably used some type of explosive packing that fuse well and then put the electric blasting cap in that way. So you'd have the Allied troops, American, ARVN, whoever, would be walking along the trail. They'd step on the pressure boards, completing the circuit, and then the mortar round, which was hidden in the bush nearby, would go off on the side of the patrol. This next one is also out of Vietnam. We have a mortar round set up for pressure activation. So this one, we had apparently was extremely common, the wooden wedge, hole in the center, nail coming down through that. Bottom of the wedge here, you had a cartridge case in here, which was going to be the primer. Attached to the cartridge case was a non-electric blasting cap, and then the filler inside here to fill up the empty space, they would primarily use PETN. As I've said before, PETN is a higher order explosive. It's used in blasting caps. It's a strong enough explosive it can set off other explosives, such as Comp B, C3, C4, Semtex, and also TNT, and pretty much any civilian explosive you can think of. So we had the wedge here. The cap would go down in here, and I got a feeling on this one, because of size, they probably did drill a hole in the fuse well here so that that cap would go down into the explosive in the round. The round is buried almost flush with the ground. Camouflage, the only thing that would be up above the camouflage would be the nail head. That nail head would be, you know, it's not going to be brand new, it's going to be rusty, you know, something like that that's going to blend it in. The Allied soldier would come along, step on it, and he has a mortar round going off underneath his foot, which more than likely would take off both his legs, if not kill him outright, and it would injure anyone in front of him and behind him in the patrol. So there you go. 6 different ways that mortars have been used through history by guerrillas against counterinsurgents. A guerrilla is not going to waste materials. He's going to use whatever he has. And if it's a piece of ordnance that he cannot fire because he does not have the weapon system for it, he's going to figure out some way to turn that into a booby trap so that he can still cause casualties on those counterinsurgents, those counter-guerrilla forces. It's pretty ingenious, fairly simple overall on all these different designs. It's just based on what materials you have available at the time. Now, I know I should put out the obligatory notice about don't do this with live ordnance, but let's be serious here. You're not going to get a hold of mortar rounds right now. The only time you're going to get a hold of them is after a conflict would begin. So, do you have some examples here? If you're going to do a display for Vietnam reenactments, you know, to show people what the Allied troops would come across, here you got some examples. You can find pictures of some of this stuff, but a lot of it is also mentions inside history books, or you might find a drawing inside one manual, and that's it. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essayons.